Dad confronts son's bully. Shocking fight scene. Have you ever wondered how far you would go to protect your child? What would happen if you discovered your son was being bullied and the aggressor had an unexpected connection to your past? This is the story of an ordinary father who, upon discovering his son's silent suffering, confronts his own demons and makes a decision that will change the lives of everyone involved. Every day, thousands of children suffer in silence from the torment of bullies carrying emotional scars that can last a lifetime. And behind every bully, there's an untold story, a hidden pain that has turned them into what they are. This is a story of pain, redemption, and the incredible power of forgiveness. Get ready for a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat and possibly change your perspective on bullying forever. Miguel arrived home earlier than usual that Friday. The afternoon sun cast long shadows in the hallway as he hung up his jacket and placed his keys on the table. The house was unusually quiet. "Carlos, are you home, son?" he called, expecting the energetic response of his 13-year-old son. Silence. With a sigh, Miguel headed toward Carlos's room. The door was slightly ajar. He knocked gently. "Carlos?" He pushed the door open and found his son sitting on the bed, his back to the entrance, shoulders slumped. Hearing his father's voice, Carlos quickly wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his hoodie. "I'm fine, Dad. Just tired," he said without turning around. Miguel sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, noticing how his son tensed up. "Would you let me see your face, please?" Carlos hesitated a moment before slowly turning around. Miguel held his breath. His son's left eye was swollen and darkened by a bruise that was beginning to form. His lower lip was split, with a small line of dried blood. "Who did this to you?" Miguel asked, keeping his voice calm despite the rage that was beginning to grow inside him. "I fell during PE," Carlos answered, avoiding his father's gaze. Miguel gently took his son's chin, forcing him to look him in the eyes. "Carlos, I've been a single father for 7 years. I know you better than anyone in this world. This wasn't a fall." Carlos's eyes filled with tears. "It was just a stupid fight, Dad. It's nothing." Miguel noticed something on the floor. Carlos's backpack was torn, with books and notebooks scattered around. He bent down and picked up the math notebook, now stained with what appeared to be juice or soda. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, leafing through the ruined notebook. Carlos remained silent. "Carlos, please, I need to know." 3 months, he finally whispered. "Since Alejandro came to the school." Miguel closed his eyes for a moment, processing the information. 3 months. His son had been suffering for 3 months without saying a word. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, sitting down again next to Carlos. Carlos finally broke down in tears. "Because you said that Ramirez men are strong, that we should solve our own problems. I didn't want to disappoint you." The words hit Miguel like a punch to the stomach. His own words, spoken with the intention of strengthening his son, had become chains that kept him suffering in silence. "Carlos, listen to me," he said, taking his son's hands. "Being strong doesn't mean suffering alone. Being strong means having the courage to ask for help when you need it." As he embraced his son, Miguel felt something breaking inside him, the dam that contained his own painful memories. Memories he had buried so deeply that he had almost forgotten they existed. "I promise you we're going to solve this together," he whispered. "No one, absolutely no one, has the right to hurt you." That night, as Carlos finally slept, Miguel sat in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee between his hands, staring at the wall. The memories he had kept locked away for decades now flowed freely, and with them, an unshakable determination to protect his son. The digital clock on the microwave read 3:17 a.m., but Miguel hadn't moved from the kitchen table. Sleep was impossible, with the memories that now swirled through his mind like a violent storm. He opened the bottom drawer of the kitchen cabinet and pulled out an old cigar box. Inside, beneath old receipts and forgotten birthday cards, lay a faded photograph, a skinny, gap-toothed boy with a forced smile and eyes that couldn't hide his fear. Himself at 14. "I thought I'd put all this behind me," he whispered to the empty kitchen. Miguel had grown up in a rough neighborhood where showing weakness was an invitation to be preyed upon. For 2 years of high school, he had been the target of relentless bullying by Victor Morales, the school's unofficial king. Every day had been a battle to survive, dodging Victor in hallways, eating lunch in bathroom stalls, walking 2 miles out of his way to avoid being caught alone. His father, a hard-working man who believed that boys should handle their own problems, had offered little sympathy. "Stand up for yourself or they'll never stop," he'd say. But Miguel had been skinny, uncoordinated, and terrified. Standing up for himself wasn't an option until that one fateful day when everything changed. Miguel had been cornered behind the gym, surrounded by Victor and his friends. The beating that followed was worse than usual, leaving him with 2 broken ribs and a concussion. As he lay on the ground, tasting blood and dirt, something inside him had snapped. The next day, he'd brought his father's wrench to school, wrapped in a towel inside his backpack. When Victor approached him after school, Miguel had swung without thinking, catching Victor in the knee. The sickening crack and Victor's scream still echoed in his nightmares occasionally. Victor had needed 2 surgeries. His promising baseball career had ended that day. Miguel had been suspended, nearly expelled, and the guilt had followed him for years. Even now, 2 decades later, the memory made his stomach twist. He hadn't become the bully, he'd simply gone invisible. He'd learned to blend in, to never draw attention, to disappear in plain sight, a skill he'd perfected and carried into adulthood. When Carlos was born, Miguel had vowed to raise him differently, to teach him to be strong without being cruel, to stand tall without stepping on others. But somewhere along the way, he realized now he'd passed on his father's rigid expectations of manhood without the context of his own painful experiences. "Dad!" Carlos's voice startled him from the doorway. His son stood there in pajamas, too small for his growing frame, his bruised face looking even worse in the harsh kitchen light. "Hey, kiddo, can't sleep?" Miguel quickly tucked the photograph back into the cigar box. Carlos shook his head, sliding into the chair across from his father. "My face hurts." Miguel got up and grabbed an ice pack from the freezer, wrapping it in a kitchen towel. "Here, this will help with the swelling." As Carlos held the ice pack to his face, Miguel made a decision. "Carlos, there's something I need to tell you. Something that happened to me when I was about your age." For the next hour, Miguel told his son everything. The bullying he'd endured, his fear, his shame, and finally the violent outburst that had changed 2 lives forever. Carlos listened in silence, his eyes widening at parts of the story. "I've never told anyone this," Miguel finished. "Not even your mother knew the whole story." "What happened to Victor?" Carlos asked quietly. "Last I heard, he became a physical therapist, working with injured athletes." Miguel gave a sad smile. "Ironic, isn't it?" Carlos was quiet for a long moment. "So what do we do about Alejandro?" Miguel reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. "We don't make my mistakes. We don't suffer in silence. And we don't resort to violence. Tomorrow, we're going to the school to speak with the principal." Carlos nodded, but Miguel could see the doubt in his eyes. "And Carlos, after that, I'm going to find out who this Alejandro is, and I'm going to have a conversation with his parents. This ends now." What Miguel didn't tell his son was the strange feeling that had been growing since he'd heard the bully's name. Alejandro wasn't a common name in their small town. And the timing of the new student's arrival coincided with rumors of Victor Morales moving back to town after his divorce. Miguel's mind flashed back to the newspaper clipping he'd saved all those years ago. An engagement announcement featuring Victor Morales and Alejandra Suarez. If Victor had a son, he would be about Carlos's age now. And if that son was named after his mother, Miguel felt a chill run down his spine. Some ghosts, it seemed, refused to stay buried. Monday morning arrived with a determined knock on Principal Washington's door. Miguel had taken the day off work, dressed in his best button-down shirt and slacks, the ones he reserved for important client meetings. Carlos sat beside him, fidgeting nervously in the chair outside the principal's office. "It'll be okay," Miguel assured him, though he wasn't entirely convinced himself. Principal Washington, a stern woman with kind eyes behind severe glasses, listened carefully as Miguel explained the situation, occasionally glancing at Carlos's still visible bruises. "Mr. Ramirez, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention," she said when he finished. "Bullying is absolutely not tolerated at Jefferson Middle School. I'll speak with Alejandro and his father immediately." "His father?" Miguel asked, his throat suddenly dry. "Yes, Victor Morales. He moved back to town about 3 months ago after his divorce. He's been very involved in Alejandro's education, actually. Volunteers for school events." Miguel felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. His suspicions confirmed, he struggled to maintain his composure. "Is there something wrong, Mr. Ramirez?" Principal Washington asked, noticing his reaction. "No, I think Victor and I knew each other a long time ago." After the meeting, Miguel dropped Carlos off at his aunt's house. "I need to look into something," he explained. "I'll pick you up later." He drove directly to the town library, where the local newspaper archives were kept. The librarian, Mrs. Patel, had been there for as long as Miguel could remember. "Miguel Ramirez, I haven't seen you since you were checking out science fiction novels every week," she exclaimed. "Hello, Mrs. Patel. I need to look at some old newspapers, if that's possible." 20 minutes later, Miguel sat at a microfiche reader, scrolling through newspapers from 2 decades ago. There it was, a small article about a school incident, carefully worded to protect the minors involved. No names were mentioned, but Miguel remembered every detail. Next, he searched more recent papers. 6 months ago, local physical therapist returns to hometown. The photo showed Victor Morales, now middle-aged but still recognizable, standing outside a new clinic with his arm around a sullen teenage boy. The caption identified the boy as Alejandro Morales, 13. Miguel stared at the image of Alejandro. The boy had his father's build, already tall and broad-shouldered despite his age. But there was something in his eyes that Miguel recognized, not the confidence of a bully, but the hurt of someone carrying a heavy burden. His next stop was the coffee shop across from Morales Physical Therapy. Miguel sat by the window, watching as patients came and went. At 3:30 p.m., a teenage boy walked up to the clinic, Alejandro, recognizable from the newspaper photo. He entered the building and emerged 20 minutes later with Victor. Miguel watched as father and son walked to a blue sedan. There was tension in their body language, Victor speaking animatedly, while Alejandro stared at the ground, shoulders hunched. Before they got in the car, Victor grabbed his son's arm, saying something that made Alejandro flinch. That single gesture told Miguel everything he needed to know. The cycle was continuing. Victor, once the bully, now possibly bullying his own son, who in turn bullied others. The realization hit Miguel with unexpected force. He had spent years fearing that he had ruined Victor's life, but it seemed Victor had managed to create his own unhappiness. As Miguel drove home, his phone rang. Principal Washington's voice came through the car speakers. "Mr. Ramirez, I've spoken with both Alejandro and his father. Mr. Morales was quite defensive. He suggested that perhaps Carlos was exaggerating or even lying about the bullying. I assured him we take all reports seriously, but I thought you should know. He specifically asked if you were Carlos's father." When I confirmed this, his entire demeanor changed. Miguel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Changed how? He seemed, I'm not sure how to describe it, agitated. He said he would handle this personally and left rather abruptly with Alejandro. Miguel thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. Victor remembered him. After all these years, the connection between them remained, now threatening to entangle their sons in their unresolved past. When he picked up Carlos from his aunt's house, Miguel made a decision. He would not hide from this confrontation, but neither would he approach it with anger or fear. "I found out who Alejandro's father is," he told Carlos as they drove home. "He and I have a history, a complicated one." "Is he the guy you hit with the wrench?" Carlos asked quietly. Miguel nodded. "Which means this situation is more complicated than I thought. But I promise you, we're going to resolve it the right way this time." As they pulled into their driveway, Miguel noticed a blue sedan parked across the street. Victor was leaning against it, arms crossed, watching their house. Alone. "Carlos, go inside and lock the door," Miguel said calmly. "Your uncle's number is on the refrigerator. If anything happens, call him immediately." "Dad, what's going on?" Fear crept into Carlos's voice. "Just an overdue conversation," Miguel said, his eyes not leaving the figure across the street. "Everything will be fine." As Carlos reluctantly went inside, Miguel took a deep breath and walked toward the man who had once been his tormentor, and then his victim. 20 years of history hung in the air between them as Miguel approached, unsure if this confrontation would end in violence or something entirely unexpected. The distance between Miguel's driveway and the blue sedan seemed to stretch endlessly. With each step, Miguel's memories flashed before him. The torment of his school days, the sickening sound of metal hitting bone, the guilt that had shadowed him for decades. Victor straightened as Miguel approached. The years had thickened his once athletic frame, and threads of gray ran through his dark hair. But his eyes, those were exactly as Miguel remembered them, intense and unreadable. "Ramirez," Victor said, his voice deeper than in Miguel's memories. "I thought it might be you when the principal mentioned Carlos's last name." "Victor," Miguel acknowledged, stopping a cautious distance away. "I heard you were back in town." A tense silence stretched between them. In the quiet suburban street, with manicured lawns and chirping birds, these two men stood frozen in a moment detached from time, connected by a violent act from 20 years ago. "Your boy says my Alejandro has been bullying him," Victor finally said, his tone surprisingly neutral. "Not says, he has been. Alejandro gave him a black eye and a split lip on Friday. It's been going on for months." Victor's jaw tightened. "And you came to tell me this personally? Or did you bring another wrench?" The words carried less venom than Miguel had expected. "I didn't know Alejandro was your son until today," Miguel replied honestly. "I went to the school principal first, the way it should be handled." Victor ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it sent Miguel back to high school hallways. "Look, I need to see for myself. Is your boy home? I want to talk to him." Miguel tensed. "That's not happening. Carlos has been through enough." "You think I'd hurt a kid?" Victor's voice rose. "Is that what you think of me?" "I don't know what to think of you," Miguel replied. "The last time I saw you, you were making my life hell, and now your son is doing the same to mine." Victor's face darkened. For a moment, Miguel thought he might lunge forward, and his body automatically prepared for a fight. But then, unexpectedly, Victor's shoulders slumped. "I deserved that," he said quietly. "I was a monster to you back then." The admission stunned Miguel into silence. "But Alejandro," Victor continued, shaking his head, "he's not like I was. He's a good kid, sensitive even. Always has been. This doesn't make sense." Miguel studied Victor's face, looking for signs of deception. Instead, he saw genuine confusion and concern. "Would you believe me?" Miguel said slowly. "If I told you that when I saw Alejandro with you today, I recognized something in him? Not a bully's confidence, but a victim's pain." Victor's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that sometimes those who are hurting end up hurting others." For a moment, Victor seemed ready to explode with anger. Then, to Miguel's shock, his eyes filled with tears. "He's been different since the divorce," Victor said, his voice barely audible. "His mother, she left us for her yoga instructor, moved to California, barely calls him." He looked away, embarrassed by his emotional display. "I've been trying to toughen him up. Life isn't kind to soft men." The phrase sent a chill down Miguel's spine. It could have come directly from his own father's mouth. My father used to say the same thing, Miguel said, and look where it got us. Victor leaned back against his car, suddenly looking exhausted. I don't know how to do this, Ramirez. Being a single dad, I'm screwing it up just like my old man did. A car drove by, the driver curiously eyeing the two men in their intense conversation. In the distance, Miguel could see Carlos watching anxiously from the living room window. Victor, we have two choices here, Miguel said firmly. We can continue the cycle that started with our fathers, or we can break it right now. What are you suggesting? Let's get our boys together, supervised. Let's talk about what's been happening and why. No accusations, no punishment, just honest conversation. Victor hesitated, then nodded slowly. Alejandro's in the car, actually. He refused to get out, said he was too embarrassed. Miguel's eyes widened in surprise. Carlos is inside. Give me a minute to talk to him. 10 minutes later, in Miguel's living room, two fathers and two sons sat awkwardly across from each other. Carlos kept his eyes down, occasionally touching his bruised face. Alejandro, larger than Carlos but somehow seeming smaller in this moment, sat rigid beside his father, his expression a mixture of defiance and shame. All right, Miguel said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. We're here because something has been happening between you two that needs to stop. But before we talk about that, I think there's a story that both of you need to hear. He looked at Victor, raising an eyebrow in question. Victor hesitated, then nodded. 20 years ago, Miguel began, your fathers knew each other, and not in a good way. For the next 30 minutes, with occasional input from Victor, Miguel told their sons the full story of their shared past, Victor's bullying, Miguel's fear and eventual violent retaliation, and the consequences that followed. The point is, Miguel concluded, violence and intimidation never solve anything. They only create more pain, more regret, and they can echo through lives for decades. As your fathers, we never expected our past would come back to affect you both, but here we are. The room fell silent. Carlos was staring at his father with new eyes, perhaps seeing for the first time the vulnerable teenager inside the strong man he knew. Alejandro was looking at the floor, tears silently streaming down his face. Alejandro, Victor said gently, is there something you want to say to Carlos? Alejandro shook his head, not in refusal, but in apparent disbelief. I didn't know, he whispered. I didn't know your dad was the one who hurt my dad's leg. Everyone in the room froze. What do you mean? Victor asked, turning to face his son fully. The kids at school, Alejandro continued, his voice breaking. They told me on my first day that Carlos's dad crippled you, that he ruined your life on purpose because he was jealous. They said the Ramirez family had always hated us. Miguel and Victor exchanged shocked glances. The small-town rumor mill had preserved and twisted their story, passing it down to a new generation. That's not true, Victor said firmly. No one ruined anyone's life. What happened between Miguel and me was complicated, but it's our past, not yours. Then why did you tell me I needed to be tougher than everyone else? Alejandro challenged, his voice rising. Why do you get so angry when I lose at anything? You said I could never show weakness because people would take advantage of me, just like what happened to you. Victor's face crumpled with realization. Without saying it directly, he had passed his fears and resentments to his son, who had interpreted them in the worst possible way. I thought, Alejandro continued, now addressing Carlos directly, I thought I was supposed to show you that our family wasn't weak, that we couldn't be pushed around. His voice dropped to a whisper. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just didn't want to disappoint my dad. Carlos, who had been silent throughout, finally spoke. I didn't tell my dad about you for the same reason. I didn't want to disappoint him either. The boys looked at each other, recognizing a shared experience neither had expected. Miguel and Victor exchanged glances, the weight of their influence on their sons suddenly, painfully clear. I think, Miguel said slowly, that we all have some healing to do, and maybe, just maybe, this is where it starts. What had begun as a potential fight had transformed into something none of them had anticipated. A chance at reconciliation, not just between two boys, but between their fathers as well. The following Saturday, an unusual scene unfolded at the local park. Miguel and Carlos arrived to find Victor and Alejandro already there, setting up a small grill near the picnic tables. It had been Victor's idea, a cookout to give the boys a chance to interact in a relaxed setting. As the adults prepared lunch, Carlos and Alejandro sat awkwardly at the edge of the basketball court, occasionally exchanging brief comments. The tension remained, but something had shifted since their living room confrontation. "They'll find their way," Victor said, noticing Miguel watching the boys. "Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for." Miguel nodded, still surprised by the turn of events. After their initial confrontation, he and Victor had spoken several times, working out a plan to address the situation beyond simply punishing Alejandro or changing Carlos's classes. "I scheduled Alejandro's first therapy appointment," Victor said quietly, flipping burgers on the grill. "For both of us, actually. Family counseling." Miguel raised his eyebrows, impressed. Victor Morales, the once proud athlete who believed therapy was for the weak, had changed more than he'd realized. "It's not easy," Victor continued, avoiding Miguel's gaze. "Admitting you've been passing down the worst parts of your own upbringing. My father—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I know." Miguel said, "Mine was the same." On the basketball court, something unexpected was happening. Alejandro had taken out a basketball from his backpack and was showing Carlos some dribbling techniques. Carlos, always more academic than athletic, was attempting to copy the movements with limited success. But he was trying, and Alejandro was patiently demonstrating again and again. "Look at that," Victor said, nudging Miguel. "Your boy's a trier, and yours is a good teacher," Miguel replied. "Who would have thought?" After lunch, as the boys continued their impromptu basketball lesson, Miguel and Victor sat at the picnic table, watching. "There's something I've been wanting to ask," Miguel said. "That day when I hit you with the wrench, did you know I had it? Did you see it coming?" Victor was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he finally said. "I saw you take it out of your bag. I could have walked away, but you didn't." "No," Victor sighed heavily. "Part of me wanted it to happen, wanted someone to finally stop me." He rubbed his knee absently. "My father he used to beat me pretty regularly. Baseball was my only escape, but the pressure was intense. I had to be the best, always. When I was hurting others, at least I wasn't the one being hurt." Miguel absorbed this revelation in silence. All these years, he had carried the guilt of potentially ruining Victor's promising future. He had never considered that Victor might have been seeking an escape from that very future. "Is that why you came back to town?" Miguel asked. "After all these years?" Victor nodded. "After the divorce, I had a choice. Stay in the city where everything reminded me of my failed marriage, or come back here and finally face my past. I chose the harder path for Alejandro's sake. I didn't want him growing up with a father who runs from his mistakes." On the court, Alejandro had just shown Carlos how to execute a simple layup. When Carlos finally made one, Alejandro gave him a high five, both boys breaking into genuine smiles for the first time. "The truth is," Victor continued, his voice thick with emotion, "Alejandro's been bullied himself at his previous school. He was the quiet kid, the sensitive one, always drawing, writing poetry. The divorce hit him hard, and he closed up. When we moved here and he heard those rumors about our families, I think he decided to reinvent himself, become the person he thought I wanted him to be." Miguel felt a surge of compassion for the boy who had hurt his son. "Does Carlos know this?" "I don't think so. Alejandro doesn't talk about it." Miguel watched as the boys continued their game, seeing them with new eyes. Two sons carrying the weight of their father's expectations and histories. Two boys trying to be men before they'd had the chance to be children. They need better from us, Miguel said finally. Better than what we had. Agreed, Victor replied. Which is why I've been thinking. The school has this mentoring program for troubled kids. I was considering volunteering, but I think we should do it together. Show them a different way to handle conflict. Miguel turned to look at his former tormentor, now offering a path toward healing, not just for their sons, but for the community and perhaps for themselves. You know what? I think that's the best idea you've ever had, Morales. Victor smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face. Well, it only took me 20 years to have a good one. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, the four of them packed up their things. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they were all moving in the right direction. Same time next week? Victor asked as they prepared to leave. Miguel looked at Carlos, who nodded hesitantly but with a small smile. Same time next week, Miguel confirmed. The two families parted ways, walking to their respective cars. But unlike 20 years ago, when they had parted as enemies, now they separated, with the fragile promise of something resembling peace. 3 weeks later, Jefferson Middle School's gymnasium was packed with students, teachers, and parents for the annual anti-bullying assembly. This year, however, featured unexpected speakers, Miguel Ramirez and Victor Morales, along with their sons. Principal Washington introduced them with obvious surprise in her voice. When she had suggested they participate in the school's anti-bullying initiative, she hadn't expected them to volunteer as the main speakers. Miguel approached the microphone first, scanning the sea of young faces before him. He spotted Carlos in the front row, sitting beside Alejandro. The boys weren't quite friends yet, but they had reached a cautious truce that was gradually warming into something more positive. "My name is Miguel Ramirez," he began, his voice echoing through the gymnasium. 20 years ago, I sat where you're sitting now in this very school, and I was terrified every single day. A hush fell over the audience as Miguel shared his story. Not the sanitized version he had told himself over the years, but the raw truth of his fear, his shame, and eventually, his violent response. "I thought I had two choices," he explained. "Continue to be a victim or become the aggressor. What I didn't realize was that there are always more options than we can see when we're trapped in cycles of fear and pain." Victor stepped forward next, standing tall despite the slight limp that had never fully disappeared. "I was the bully in Miguel's story," he said bluntly, causing a ripple of whispers through the crowd. "I terrorized him and others because I was being terrorized at home. That doesn't excuse my actions, nothing could. But understanding why people hurt others is the first step toward breaking the cycle." As the assembly continued, Miguel watched the students' reactions. Some looked bored, others uncomfortable, but many were listening intently, perhaps recognizing aspects of their own lives in these stories. When it was the boys' turn to speak, Carlos went first, his voice initially shaky but growing stronger. "A few months ago I was being bullied, and I was too afraid to tell anyone. I thought being strong meant handling it myself. Now I know that real strength is having the courage to ask for help." Alejandro stepped up next, towering over Carlos, but somehow seeming more vulnerable. "I came to this school and heard stories about a feud between our families," he said, gesturing toward Carlos. "I thought I had to be tough to protect my family's reputation. I was wrong, and I hurt someone who never did anything to deserve it." He paused, looking directly at Carlos. "I'm sorry, and I'm trying to be better." The simplicity and sincerity of his apology brought unexpected tears to Miguel's eyes. He glanced at Victor and saw the same emotion reflected there. Pride mixed with regret, hope tempered by the knowledge of how easily things could have gone differently. After the assembly, as students filed out, a small group of boys approached Carlos and Alejandro. Miguel tensed, watching carefully, but his concern proved unnecessary. One of the boys was asking Alejandro about the basketball team tryouts, while another was showing Carlos something on his phone. all of them laughing together. Principal Washington joined Miguel and Victor as they watched their sons. "I've been an educator for 30 years," she said, "and I've never seen anything quite like what you two have accomplished, turning a potentially explosive situation into a learning opportunity for the entire school." "We're just trying to give them what we didn't have," Victor replied, "a chance to break the cycle." The mentoring program they had proposed was already taking shape. Twice a week, Miguel and Victor met with a small group of students identified as either bullies or victims, sharing their experiences and teaching conflict resolution skills. The program had been met with skepticism initially, but the results were beginning to speak for themselves. That evening, as Miguel helped Carlos with his math homework, his son looked up suddenly. "Dad, do you think people can really change? Like, completely?" Miguel considered the question carefully. "I don't know if people change completely, but I believe we can learn to make different choices, even when the old patterns feel more familiar." Carlos nodded thoughtfully. "Alejandro told me that before his parents divorced, he used to write poetry. He showed me some. It's actually pretty good." "Is that so?" Miguel smiled, remembering Victor's revelation about his son's artistic tendencies. "Yeah. He's going to join the literary magazine, and he's helping me practice for basketball tryouts." Carlos hesitated. I think we might actually become friends. Is that weird?" Miguel put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Not weird at all. Sometimes the most unexpected friendships turn out to be the most meaningful." Later that night, Miguel received a text from Victor. Alejandro showed Carlos his poetry. First time he's shared it with anyone since the divorce. "Thank you." Miguel stared at the message, marveling at how life could come full circle in ways he never could have imagined. The lesson he had learned, that they had all learned, wasn't just about bullying. It was about the possibility of redemption, about the courage to choose a different path than the one that seemed predestined. He typed back, "Thank you too, for being brave enough to change." As he put his phone away, Miguel realized that the weight he had carried for 20 years, the guilt over hurting Victor, the shame of having been a victim, the fear that he hadn't been strong enough, had finally begun to lift. The true transformation wasn't happening just in their sons, it was happening in them as well. 6 months later, on a warm spring evening, two families gathered in Miguel's backyard for a graduation barbecue. Carlos and Alejandro had just completed 8th grade and would be starting high school in the fall. Together, as friends. The transformation in both boys was remarkable. Carlos stood taller, more confident, no longer trying to make himself invisible. Alejandro had softened, his formerly aggressive stance replaced by a more relaxed demeanor. He had recently won 2nd place in a regional poetry contest with a piece about friendship rising from adversity. Miguel watched as the boys set up a makeshift basketball hoop on the driveway. Carlos had improved tremendously under Alejandro's coaching, though he still preferred books to sports. Their differences had become complementary rather than contentious. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Victor said, joining Miguel by the grill. "If someone had told me a year ago that we'd be here like this, I would have laughed in their face." Miguel nodded, flipping burgers. Life has a way of surprising us. The mentoring program they had started at the school had expanded to 3 other schools in the district. What had begun as a way to help their sons had turned into something much larger, a community initiative to break cycles of violence and bullying. They had been featured in the local newspaper, and there was talk of a small grant to develop the program further. "Carlos told me he's thinking of trying out for the debate team in high school," Victor said, taking a sip of his lemonade. "Alejandro's been helping him practice." "And Alejandro's joining the basketball team?" Miguel asked. Victor smiled proudly. "With the literary magazine as his backup, he says he wants to do both." They watched as Maria, Miguel's sister, came out of the house carrying a large cake decorated with graduation caps. The boys abandoned their basketball game and raced over, Carlos letting Alejandro win by a hair. "You know," Victor said quietly. I spent 20 years thinking about what you did to my knee, hating you for it, blaming you for my failures. Miguel tensed, unsure where this was going. But the truth is, Victor continued, that moment saved me. If I'd continued on that path, I don't like to think about who I might have become. Miguel was silent for a moment, absorbing the unexpected confession. And I spent 20 years feeling guilty for ruining your life. Victor chuckled. You didn't ruin it, you changed it. And now, here we are, two single dads trying to be better men than our fathers were. And succeeding, I think, Miguel added, nodding toward their sons, who were now laughing with Carlos's cousins around the picnic table. Principal Washington arrived then, carrying a gift bag. She had become something of a surrogate grandmother to both boys over the past months, checking in on their progress and championing the mentoring program at every opportunity. I have an announcement, she called, gathering everyone around the table. I just got word this morning. The school board has approved funding for our anti-bullying initiative to become a permanent program at all district schools. And they want Miguel and Victor to lead the training for other parent volunteers. A cheer went up from the small gathering. Miguel caught Carlos's eye across the table and saw his son's face shining with pride. After the cake was cut and the presents opened, as the afternoon stretched into evening, Miguel found a quiet moment with Carlos on the back porch steps. Happy graduation, son, he said, putting an arm around Carlos's shoulders. I'm so proud of you. Carlos leaned against his father, a gesture he had recently become too cool for, but seemed to need in this moment. Dad, do you think things happen for a reason? Like, was Alejandro supposed to bully me so that you and his dad could make peace? Miguel considered the question. I don't know about supposed to, but I do think that sometimes pain can lead to healing, if we're brave enough to face it honestly. That's what you taught me. Me? Carlos looked surprised. Yes, you. When you finally told me what was happening, you gave me the chance to face my past. You broke our family's cycle of silence. As the fireflies began to appear in the gathering dusk, Victor and Alejandro came to say their goodbyes. The boys made plans to meet the next day for a movie, while Miguel and Victor confirmed the details for their upcoming presentation to the school board. See you Monday, Ramirez, Victor said, extending his hand. Miguel took it, then surprised them both by pulling Victor into a brief hug. Monday it is, Morales. As the two watched Victor's car drive away, Carlos turned to his father. You know what's weird? I used to think the worst day of my life was when Alejandro first hit me, but now I think it might have been the best. Miguel smiled, recognizing the wisdom in his son's words. Life's funny that way. Sometimes what looks like a fight scene is really the beginning of a healing story. Carlos nodded thoughtfully. And now we get to help other kids write their own healing stories. As father and son walked back into the house together, Miguel felt a deep sense of peace. The confrontation he had feared for so long had indeed happened, but instead of ending in violence, it had ended in reconciliation. The cycle that had begun with their fathers had been broken, and a new legacy was taking its place. A legacy not of silence and suffering, but of courage, communication, and the willingness to begin again.